Hello and welcome back to my lectures on Coleridge's Kubla Khan. In the last lecture, I had talked to you regarding the prefatory note which the poet had added to the poem when it was first published. Today, I'll take you through the first stanza of the poem itself. But before we do that, we will take a quick look at some of the takeaways from the prefatory note itself. What are the points that we note from it which could be useful for us in our interpretation of the poem itself? So, the first one is, and it relates to the story that he tells us about how he came to compose the poem. And here we find that in the story about the about how he was reading a travelogue, fell asleep, the poem coming to him in a dream. This story tells us about the coming together of the subjective and the objective, a world of outward objects and the inner world of the imagination. So this is one point that is already made in the prefatory note. Secondly, he tells us that the sleep that he fell into was a sleep of the outward senses, implying that, and almost in fact telling us that inwardly he was intensely active because he was creating, he was in the process of composing the poem. And so what he is trying to imply, it seems, is that it is only when the cold, rational world and our day-to-day activities are suspended for some time at least, that the imagination can gain primacy over our consciousness, and that is when, again, creativity can take place. And finally, the story about the villain of the piece, really, that is the man from Polog, who had come on business, obviously overstayed his welcome, and in the process disrupted the poet's throes of creativity, and it could not be recovered again, so that the poem, according to Coleridge, remains a fragment. It is unfinished. What it symbolizes is the fact that when the world of mundane reality impinges upon the world of the world created by the imagination, there is always a danger that the imagination will be lost and may be impossible almost to retrieve. Now, let us look at what passage exactly inspired Coleridge's poem. The passage from Purchas. And here, please note that although Coleridge says Purchas's Pilgrimage, the real name of the book that he was reading is Purchas His Pilgrims. Okay? And this is what Purchas writes about Kubla Khan's pleasure palace. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan build a stately palace encompassing 16 miles of plain ground with a wall, wherein are fertile meadows, pleasant springs, and delightful streams, and all sorts of beasts of chase and game, and in the midst thereof a sumptuous house of pleasure, which may be removed from place to place. This is what Purchas says, and now this is how Coleridge transforms it in his poem. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, whereof the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers, were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinners' rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. You will find that while Coleridge parallels Purchas's description to a great extent, it is not entirely the same. The fertile grounds, the springs and meadows are there, of course, as is the pleasure palace. But the pleasure palace in Purchas is something which is removable. It can be moved from place to place. Not so in Coleridge. Coleridge's dome is much more permanent, much more monumental. Secondly, the 16 miles of fertile ground that we hear of in Purchas is changed to twice 5 miles of fertile ground. Now, of course, I think Coleridge here deliberately says twice 5 miles in order to give it a kind of an incantatory quality. It's almost as if, he is weaving a spell round the readers, inviting them to come into his own Xanadu. What is even more significant is the presence of a river, the river Alf, which flows through caverns which are measureless to man. There is a hint of mystery, a hint of something beyond human comprehension, which is not at all present in Purchas's version. Similarly, while the pleasure garden is very much taken from Purchas, Coleridge encircles his pleasure garden not only with a wall, but there are also forests which are ancient as the hills. Once again, there is something which is beyond the measure of human measurements. Stanza 1 proceeds through a series of images. What are these images? The most dominant image, the central image of the poem, is introduced in the first stanza itself when Coleridge talks about the stately pleasure dome. Now you must remember that as you read the poem, you will see that every time the dome is mentioned in this poem, the word pleasure always comes in. This is because there seems to be a complete identification between this work of art and the pleasure that it affords man. I already noted that the pleasure dome in Coleridge is much more massive. It appears to be much more monumental. All right. It is something which is permanent, almost as if it signifies the permanence of art. This is in contrast to what Purchas says about the pleasure palace being moved from place to place. Remember, Purchas does not talk about a dome, but rather he talks about a pleasure palace. The second one is the river Alf, which flows through the garden. Now, Coleridge uses the adjective sacred in order to describe the river Alf. Why he does that is something that I will be discussing shortly. The point to note here is that this river is the river which is the source of fertility in this garden. And this river has a mysterious origin and it ends in a sunless sea, also signifying mystery. I will come back to these points shortly. The third image that we find in the first stanza is, of course, the image of the garden. Now, what is this garden like? It is a walled place. All right. The garden is almost like a paradisal garden, a paradise. Traditionally, paradise is supposed to be a walled space. So this garden is like an earthly paradise. And it is a place where wild nature has been contained by encircling twice 5 miles of fertile ground. What Kubla Khan seems to have done is he seems to have contained the wild savagery of untamed nature within his encircled garden. So there is a sense of containment. There is a sense of nature's abundance being given a particular periphery and a particular form. And there is also a sense that nature is here cultivated. So nature seems to be almost bettered. The wilder aspect of nature there seems to be at least an attempt to obliterate the wilder aspects of nature. But that is not quite successful, because very soon we will see that right in the heart of this garden there is a disruptive fountain. Not only that, the caverns measureless to man, through which the river Alf flows. That too is something which is beyond human control. So the garden, although it is considered to be a pleasure garden, is also a place of a curious tension. It is a tension between something which is cultivated, cultured, the refinement of art, but art is not only about refinement. Art is about life, and life is not all refinement. Life has its darker sides also. And so, within that aesthetic experience of art, you also have the suggestion of the darker aspects of life. Without this art would be incomplete. Now, the point that you should note here is that in talking about the river Alf, Coleridge actually he has given it a very particular name, which is full of connotations. Okay. Alf, the river Alf, this name Alf, reminds us of several things. The first is that it reminds us of the first letter of the Greek alphabet, that is Alpha. Okay. So the river Alf, therefore, by implication, is a river which seems to be associated with language. Okay. Secondly, Alf also reminds us of the myth of the river god Alpheus, who fell in love with a nymph. And this nymph was Diana's follower, and as she fled from him, he flowed under the water till he met her once again. Now, this myth of Alpheus's lust for this nymph also symbolizes the desire of the union between the male and the female. And this is something which is important when we come to Coleridge's idea regarding genius. Because according to Coleridge, all true genius is androgynous. That is, it is both male and female. Genius is not something which is predominantly male. Which is why in Kubla Khan, in the first stanza, Kubla Khan is the presiding genius. It is his word, his decree, which actually brings this pleasure garden and the pleasure dome into being. But he is not the person who contributes to the fertility of this place. That is the river Alf. The river Alf, which ultimately we will see, also symbolizes the imagination. It symbolizes language. It symbolizes, through its evocation of the myth, the union of the male and the female. So we find here then that in the very first stanza, what Coleridge does is that he is moving towards a description which uses images symbolically. A symbol is something which is able to express a complexity of ideas. It is something, it is a part which stands for a much more comprehensive whole. It is not simply a mirror image. So Coleridge's pleasure dome and pleasure garden, or rather Kubla's pleasure dome and pleasure garden, which Coleridge describes, is something which is symbolical. This is very, very clear from the very beginning of the poem, and it is something which ties up with the predominantly accepted interpretation of the poem as a symbol of the romantic imagination. Finally, you will note that the first stanza moves through a series of contrasts. It talks about twice 5 miles of fertile ground, very exact measurements, all right? But then again, it talks about caverns measureless to man. It talks about sunny spots of greenery, but it also talks about down to a sunless sea. So light and darkness, the measured and the immeasurable, all these contrasts come together in the first stanza of Kubla Khan. And this is in keeping with Coleridge's idea regarding the poetic imagination, which he terms the secondary imagination, which is able to diffuse and dissipate and dissolve into one, all contraries. More about that in my next lecture. Hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you.